Now, if you remember when we talked about tissues, this is one of the four primary tissue types. It consists of elongated muscle cells that are specialized for contraction. And this is unique in that this tissue will be stimulated and actually will contract. There are three types of muscle tissue. There's skeletal muscle, which is going to be the primary focus of this lecture. Skeletal muscle is voluntary, which means you have conscious control over it. And it's pretty much going to include most of your superficial muscles that we see. Then you have cardiac muscle, which is only found in the heart, and then smooth muscle, which is also found throughout the body, but this is also an involuntary muscle along with cardiac. So skeletal muscles are composed of skeletal muscle tissue. They also contain connective tissue, nerves, and blood vessels. They will directly or indirectly attach to bones, and the muscular system includes about 700 skeletal muscles. Don't worry, you don't need to know 700 skeletal muscles. Actually, the list will be fairly reasonable. So there are 5 skeletal muscle functions. One is they move the skeleton, meaning that they will pull on tendons that will move bones. They help to maintain the posture and body position. They will support soft tissues. For example, we know that the thoracic cavity, which is going to form from the ribs and the vertebral column and the breastbone, help to protect the heart and lungs. But if you go down a little further, your abdominal cavity, your pelvic cavity, that's really just muscles there that are protecting those tissues. They will also guard entrance and exits. For example, the oral cavity and the anal rectal cavity. Urinary tract will also have skeletal muscle that protects it. And finally, muscle will help to maintain body temperature, as muscle contractions will generate heat. So when we look at the organization of skeletal muscle tissue, the skeletal muscle is going to contain skeletal muscle tissue, connective tissues, blood vessels, and nerves. Each skeletal muscle cell is called a muscle fiber, and the difference in the terminology here is because a muscle fiber is actually going to be made up of hundreds of cells that have fused together. So it's not just one cell, but it appears to be one cell, but it's hundreds of cells that have fused together. When we look at the organization of skeletal muscle, we're going to have different layers. We'll have the epimysium, which covers the entire muscle, the perimysium divides the muscle into fascicles or bundles of muscle fibers, and it contains blood vessels and nerves that will supply the fascicles. And then the endomysium, this will cover each muscle fiber, individual muscle fiber, and ties the fibers together. And it contains capillaries and nerve fibers. And this is sort of a hierarchy where we're going from biggest down to smallest. And here we can see that. So in the first part here, we have the epimysium covering the outer. Then we have bundles of fascicles. That's what these things are. Each fascicle is going to be covered by a perimysium, and then a bundle of a fascicle is just a bundle of muscle fibers, and each muscle fiber is going to be covered by a endomysium. So the connective tissue attachments, these are collagen fibers from all 3 layers of connective tissue come together at the end of the muscle to form a tendon, which is a bundle of fibers, and it's going to attach the muscle to the bone, as well as aponeurosis, which is a broad sheet of fibers that connects muscles to each other. The blood vessels and nerves supplying muscle, there is an extensive network of blood vessels in skeletal muscles that is necessary to supply the high energy use required by this tissue. Skeletal muscles under voluntary control, meaning that the part of your brain that we refer to as the somatic nervous system controls this. And this is the part that you are consciously aware of. We have control of their contractions, conscious control of their contractions. It does require stimulation by the central nervous system in order to contract, and axons or nerve fibers run through the connective tissue layers to innervate individual muscle fibers. And here's what's going to initiate a muscle contraction. This right here is going to be the end of a axon, which is the end of a nerve. This right here is going to be one muscle fiber. And what happens is a neurotransmitter is going to get released, acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is released at the neuromuscular junction, which is this connection point between the nerve and the muscle, and binds to the acetylcholine receptors located on the surface of the muscle fiber. The surface of the muscle fiber is referred to as the sarcolemma. This will cause an action potential to be generated. An action potential is an electric signal that transmits from the nerve now to the muscle. That action potential will then reach a T-tubule, which is an inversion of the sarcolemma deep into the muscle fiber. The action potential will travel down the T-tubule, and it will actually activate a sarcoplasmic reticulum. Now, the sarcoplasmic reticulum is a smooth ER of skeletal muscles. And this particular smooth ER is going to store calcium. And when the action potential traveling down the T-tubule activates the sarcoplasmic reticulum, what happens is the calcium will then get released. The calcium will then bind to active sites on troponin. Troponin is going to essentially expose or block active sites on the thin filaments. And when you bind calcium to troponin, you remove that blocking nature. The thin filaments of the muscle fiber is going to be actin. The thick filaments are myosin. And what happens is, upon the release of calcium, you're exposing this binding sites, allowing myosin to bind. And what will happen is the contraction cycle will then begin. With the contraction cycle, we'll see this in a little bit, but essentially what's going to happen is this myosin head's going to bind and it's going to pull forward, okay? And if you look here, you can see the myosin heads are binding, and it's going to pull the thin filaments indicated in red here towards the midline. And essentially, with this action of the myosin heads binding and pulling the thin filaments, what's going to happen is that will actually cause the whole muscle to shrink, because you're getting overlap between the thick and thin filaments then. The steps that will end muscle contraction is the acetylcholine will get broken down by an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase. Without acetylcholine, the action potential ceases. Without the action potential, the sarcoplasmic reticulum will then reabsorb the calcium. Without calcium, the troponin will then block the actin binding sites. Myosin can no longer bind, and you get no longer the contraction. So what happens is it just passively will relax back to its initial state. The relaxation I like people to think of is imagine you have a spring and you compress that spring. It shrinks, right? That's what's happening here with the muscle. But if you remove your fingers at either end of the spring, what happens? The spring returns back to its normal state. Now, ATP is the energy source for muscle contractions. Muscle contraction requires large amounts of energy in the form of ATP. Resting muscle fibers contain only enough energy reserves to maintain muscle contractions until more ATP is generated. During a contraction, the muscle generates ATP at the same rate that it's used. So you're producing it as you're using it, essentially. Now, muscle fatigue, this is when you have muscle will no longer perform at the required level, even if it's stimulated. This is caused by depletion of energy reserves or a decline in pH from the lactic acid production. This affects muscles of endurance, athletes after using stores of glycogen and lipids. It affects sprinters more quickly as they rapidly build up lactic acid, lowering the tissue pH. And whenever you exercise, there is what we call a recovery period. This is a time of returning muscle to normal pre-exertion conditions by restoring oxygen levels, removing lactic acid, replacing intracellular energy reserves, and losing heat produced by the contraction. Now, some changes that occur during the recovery period. The breathing rate and the depth remain increased to repay oxygen debt. The oxygen debt is the additional oxygen that's required to restore back to resting conditions, meaning how much oxygen is required to do cellular respiration to return you back to what we refer to as normal resting conditions. Any lactic acid or lactate that you produced is converted back to pyruvate, which can be used in cellular respiration. Reserves of ATP, creatine phosphate, and glycogen are then restored. The rate of heat loss will increase. Sweat gland secretions will increase. Blood flow to the skin will also increase. Now, if we talk a little bit about cardiac muscle tissue, this is found only in the heart. Cardiac muscle cells are relatively small with usually one central nucleus, striated and branched, and they have a particular feature that we talked about with the tissues, intercalated disc. It's the intercalated disc that will connect cells to other cells. They contain gap junctions that allow rapid communication between all cells, resulting in simultaneous contraction. Here's a picture of cardiac muscle, and you can see these little intercalated discs there. Now, differences between cardiac and skeletal muscles. Automaticity. Cardiac muscle tissue can contract without any neural stimulation, and this is because of pacemaker cells. Pacemaker cells are specialized cardiac muscle cells that determine the timing of the contraction. Longer contractions are about 10 times longer than skeletal muscle. Tetanus is a sustained contraction, and that cannot occur with cardiac muscle. So we'll get more into cardiac muscle physiology when we get to the heart. Another difference is extracellular calcium ions. Action potentials increases the permeability of cardiac muscle cell plasma membrane to calcium. This allows entry of additional calcium through the plasma membrane. The cardiac muscle cells rely on aerobic metabolism. Okay, so talking about smooth muscles. Smooth muscle cells are similar in size to cardiac muscle cells. They are spindle-shaped and have a single nucleus. They are found in the walls of most organs in the form of sheets, bundles, or sheaths. And here's a picture of smooth muscle. And again, we'll talk about more with smooth muscle in some of the later chapters that we get into. But let's just talk a little bit briefly about the arrangement of smooth muscle. Smooth muscle lacks myofibrils, sarcomeres, and striations. It's not going to have, those structures that we see with skeletal muscle. Thick and thin filaments are scattered. Adjacent cells are bound together, and you end up with a contractile force transmitted throughout the tissue. Some functional differences in smooth muscle tissue is that contractions are triggered differently. Most calcium for trigger events from extracellular fluid. That's where it's obtained from. They will contract over a greater range of lengths. Actin and myosin are not rigidly organized, and they function involuntarily. They can respond to hormones or pace setter cells that we talked about with the cardiac muscle. It can also respond to motor neurons. And here's just a table that sort of compares and contrasts the differences between the three types of muscle tissue. Okay. And that will be the end of recording 1. Recording 2 will now start to get into actual skeletal muscles, which will be the remaining portion of this chapter.